Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live session within the second International Electronic Conference on Brain Sciences. This conference has been organized by MDPI and the MDPI journal Brain Sciences, and it is chaired by Professor Stephen Meriney from the University of Pittsburgh in USA. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just a bit of information of the conference. The conference is now open for discussion, so you have until the 30th of July to check and comment all the abstract, papers, posters, and slides presented to the conference. So feel free to go to the conference webpage to check on it. I would like to remind everyone that this live session is being recorded and that the recording will be posted in the conference webpage for everyone to watch as soon as possible. We will have 3 presentations today from our speaker panel, including Professor Pierluigi Zoccolotti, Professor Brian Butterworth, and Professor Maaike Vandermosten. At the end of each talk and also at the end of the session, we will hold a Q&A session, so during which we will address all the questions submitted by the live online audience. So if you are joining us live, please type your question in the QA box that you will find at the bottom of your screen. Today's session will be chaired by the session chair, Professor Pierluigi Zoccolotti. Pierluigi is a professor of general psychology at the Department of Psychology of the Sapienza University of Rome in Italy, where he teaches learning disabilities in the master course in cognitive neuroscience. Since the late 1990s, his research has focused on developmental deficits in reading and writing. This theme has been examined in studies ranging from perception to eye movements and psycholinguistics. Thank you so much for chairing this session. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you for my colleagues, Professor Butterworth, Professor Vandermosten, to join in this live session. What we want to present is an update on developmental dyscalculia and dyslexia, focusing both on cognitive data and on neurophysiological and neuroimaging data. And we're gonna start immediately with Professor Butterworth with an update or research on dyscalculia. Brian, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to, I was going to say a great pleasure to be in Rome, but it's unfortunately not in Rome.
Virtual.
So here I am, still in London. So I'm going to talk, as the title says, a bit about what we know about dyscalculia and what we need to find out, what we need to do. So there's a certain practical aspect to what I'm going to say. So I'll start with where we are. So dyscalculia is not just being bad at maths. It concerns numbers and arithmetic, but not other branches of mathematics. So I know very distinguished mathematicians who work in areas like geometry and topology, whose arithmetical calculation is not very good. I also have subjects in my lab who've managed to pass their mathematics exams because even though they were very bad at arithmetic, they were very good at geometry. So the first person really to describe developmental dyscalculia was Ladislav Koch. And he said that it's a genetic or congenital disorder of those parts of the brain that are the direct anatomico-physiological substrate of the maturation of the mathematical abilities. Okay, you don't have to understand that, but the next part is really important. If a person has had inadequate instruction, or if a child, because of neurosis, objective illness, or fatigue, is not able to demonstrate his potential abilities or directly acquired knowledge or skills adequately, this is not a disorder of those abilities, but as such, but a deficit, which he calls pseudo-dyscalculia. If we have a look at prevalence studies for dyscalculia, there's some good large-scale studies. Morsani in Northern Ireland did a very large-scale study using DSM-5 criteria, and she found about 5% of the kids there were dyscalculic. An Israeli study found a very similar number, and a study I'll describe in more detail later by Regosa and colleagues in Havana found about 3.5%. And they were able to distinguish dyscalculia from other causes of poor arithmetic. However, in experimental studies of dyscalculia, they use quite different criteria. Even Marie-Pascale Noël used the lowest 15%. Now, if the true prevalence is 5%, then the additional 10% that Roussel and Noël use is going to be a much more heterogeneous bunch of kids. There are several other criteria that have been used in experimental studies. So these studies aren't really about dyscalculia, though some dyscalculics will be in their sample. I'll return to what dyscalculia really is, but first we need to understand the cognitive basis of arithmetic, and then the neural basis of arithmetic. So arithmetic, as you all know, is about sets. Here's some examples of sets. Got a handy set on the left, and a standard way of testing how good you are at assessing the numerosity of sets in the middle. So sets, now just to remind you what you already know, a set has a definite number of members, which I call its numerosity. Adding or taking away a member changes the numerosity. Other transformations may conserve numerosity. Numerical order can be defined in terms of sets and subsets. Arithmetical operations can be defined in terms of operations on sets, like set union. And we learn about counting and arithmetic using sets, usually of concrete objects, and about the meaning of number terms. I mean, you learn what 3 is by being shown a set of 3 items, say that there are 3 dolls there. And here's a bunch of kids, these are actually in Hong Kong, learning about arithmetic with sets of concrete objects on white paper trays defining the set. Now, my theory of developmental dyscalculia, and this is not uncontroversial, is that it's a specific deficit in a basic inherited numerical capacity for the numerosity of sets, which I'm going to call the numerosity sets. So how good you are at assessing the numerosity of a set is what's going to define dyscalculia. So there's some very simple tests that you can use to assess an individual's ability to do this. So one test, which I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about in more detail, is dot enumeration time. So you can try this yourself. How many dots there are in the next slide, shout them out as fast as you can, because time and accuracy are both relevant here. Okay, I hope you all got that right, 6. And of course, you all know this kind of curve. There's a subitizing range up to about 4, and there's a point of discontinuity into the counting range or the estimating range. Whether there are 2 separate systems here, one for subitizing and one for counting or estimating, is controversial, and we don't need to go into that now, but if you want to ask me about it, I'm very happy to talk about it. So as you can see, how long it takes you to make a correct judgment depends on the number of dots, unsurprisingly. So the second sort of test is where you have to compare 2 numerosities. So here you have to say which side, right or left, has more squares, or right or left has more squares. That's easy. That one's a bit more difficult. And there's a general rule here, sometimes it's called Weber or Weber fraction or just noticeable difference, which is the ratio effect, that the difference between either 2 panels of squares or indeed 2 digits depends upon the difference between them. So the difference between say 8 and 1, that's very easy to make a judgment about. They're very quick, very accurate, but 7 and 6 is more difficult because the ratio difference is smaller, but you all know that. Now, the important point here is that these tests are good predictors of arithmetical development. And I want, first of all, just tell you where we're coming from. So in 2004, Karen Landl, Anna Bevan, and I published the first study that identified numerosity processing deficit in developmental dyscalculia. So we tested these in a borough of London, 9-year-olds with severe mathematical disabilities. We didn't really know what dyscalculia was then, but we took a very extreme sample here, 3 standard deviations worse than the age group on timed arithmetic, and also identified by teachers as having particular problems with learning arithmetic, normal or superior IQ, because we didn't want to get people saying, well, are they a bit stupid, these kids who are not very good at arithmetic? Normal reading, memory, language, and short-term memory. So people who think that reading, language, and short-term memory can be a cause of dyscalculia get ruled out by the fact that we could find lots of kids who had normal reading, language, and short-term memory, but yet were dyscalculic. We had matched controls who were from the same classes, and there were kids with reading disabilities from the same classes, RD. And so the question is, if you've got both of these conditions, are you worse than controls or any of these basic number tasks? And there's also a double deficit group. So if you've got both of these problems, reading difficulties and dyscalculia, are you worse on these tasks than those with a single dyscalculic deficit? So what we found was actually the following. So on dot enumeration time, the controls and the reading difficulty group were exactly the same, but they were faster than either the dyscalculic group or the double deficit group, who were the same. And similarly for symbol comparison, the reading difficulty group was the same as the controls, but they were both faster than the dyscalculic and the double deficit group. And subsequently, Karen Landl, not with me, did this kind of study using a different measure of numerosity processing and found the same thing, which is that the controls and the dyslexics were about the same, and the dyscalculic and the double deficit group were significantly slower. So the next study I want to talk about is the longest longitudinal study of mathematical development so far published. This is called the Melbourne Longitudinal Study, because that's where we carried out the study. And we had a lot of tests for these poor kids, and they were tested 7 times, over 20 cognitive tests per time. Most of them managed to stay the course. And what we found using a cluster analysis was that there were 3 distinct clusters using the appropriate cluster analysis criteria, Bayes criteria. So what you find is that in the 3 distinct clusters, all the kids got faster as they go from slow to fast. So at 6 years, they're slow. At 11 years, they're much faster, even in the slow group. But the slow group is slower than the medium group, which is slower than the fast group. And the point of discontinuity is different in the 3 groups. So the fast group are able to subitize 4 items, even at age 6, just like you and I can. But the slow group were only subitizing 2 at that age, but they ended up being able to subitize 4. Now their cluster membership when they're in kindergarten predicts their age-appropriate arithmetic to age 10 years. So this is their single-digit addition at 6 years. So the slow group are much worse, only getting about % right, and the fast group are getting 80% right. At two-digit arithmetic at 9.5, the slow group is still way behind on addition, subtraction, and multiplication. And at 10 years, the slow group is still way behind on subtraction, multiplication, and division. So there's a small cluster, about 7% in this sample. It's not a prevalent study, so this it's not inconsistent with the previous data. So this poor ability to enumerate sets is a core deficit in numerosity processing. It persists from kindergarten to 11 years because we've tested that separately, and it predicts who will and who will not have trouble learning arithmetic, at least to the age of 11 years. And there's a practical implication here, which is use this test in kindergarten or year 1 so that you know which children are likely to have difficulty. Now, I want to give you a proper prevalence study where we did all the right kinds of stratified random sampling. So we started with all school children aged 6 to 16 in one district in Havana Centro. From this, we selected nearly 2,000 to be tested individually, computerized testing, not easy in Havana in that time, still not easy actually. And I want to focus on one of the tests we did, which is item time dot enumeration. So these were keyboard tests. So you would see 7 dots and you had to press the key 7. So the results are this, that the prevalence of dyscalculia as we defined it in that study is inefficient dot enumeration. So this is an efficiency measure that takes into account both accuracy and speed, and poor arithmetical fluency. That's about 3.5% of our sample. So the predictive value for the gold standard of arithmetical fluency, which is what you need in school, was this. Its sensitivity, the true positive rate, was 27%, which just shows that there are many other reasons for poor arithmetic. And the specificity, and here we used, well, several different measures, but the true negative rate is 98%. That is, very few learners have a core deficit and end up good at arithmetic. So it's a really, really good and powerful test. And a negative result was very good at reassuring that a child does not have dyscalculia. The negative predictive value was 80.86. Just to distinguish dyscalculia from just being not very good at arithmetic, so what we call calculation disorder in the study based on timed arithmetic was 9.4%. And dyscalculia, which is, as I said, this fluent arithmetic plus poor numerosity processing, there's 3.5%. And there's also a qualitative difference, which is that there were more males than females who were in this category for reasons that we don't really understand, which you might want to have some comments on. What about the neural basis of dyscalculia? Again, we have to start with what the normal brain looks like when it's processing numerosities. So of course, there are many, many studies of the neural processes that underpin arithmetic, but we want to focus here on numerosity processing rather than arithmetic in general. And I'll come on to the relationship in a moment. So here we did a study in which we tried to separate out numerosity processing from just sheer quantity processing. So this was a 2x2 design. So in the time condition, you would see a sequence of blue and green squares. And in the continuous quantity condition, you would see one square which changed continuously through the same color spectrum. In the space condition, you had to say whether there are more blue squares or more green squares. In the continuous quantity condition, in all the conditions, you just had to say, was there more blue and more green? And this was done in the scanner, so we could take the activation levels for all 4 conditions. And then what we did was that we looked at the discrete, how many activations minus the analog or continuous quantity, how much activations, for the time and space and the conjunction of those two results. So because numerosity is meant to be abstract, is there somewhere in the brain that does both the numerosity distributed over time and numerosity distributed through space? And it turns out that there was, might have turned out that there wasn't. And we found that there were two areas in the brain, in the IPS right and left, which were not only distinct when you did the subtractions and the conjunction, but also where the activation depended on the ratio effect again, of green and blue rectangles. So for 11 versus 9 rectangles, you got more activation than say 14 versus 6. And in the dyscalculics that we've studied, and then another study, these two areas are abnormal. So in the the first study of dyscalculia, the dyscalculic brains by Elizabeth Isaacs, she found abnormality in the left intraparietal sulcus. We've replicated that. Papers have been submitted, led by my student Ashish Rampura, and we found the same coordinates as Isaacs, abnormality in that area. Rotzer found it an abnormality in the right intraparietal sulcus, but these were younger kids, and we know that there's a shift in the dominant hemisphere for calculation from according to age. And these areas, as you can see, are part of the arithmetical brain. A nice study by Andres and colleagues who also looked at these areas and then zapped them with magnetic stimuli, and they found that this interfered with calculation. So that's a good study. Is dyscalculia heritable? Well, it's hard to say, really. There's, if you look at twin studies, you find that there seems to be a distinct genetic variance that's specific to maths, not necessarily to dyscalculia, but to maths. So that at least gives us a start on this study. And I'll just say a little bit more about a twin study that we've been doing. And we've also had a look at Yulia Kovas and I, looking at the genetic variants of various developmental disorders, ADHD, ASD, and SLI, as well as dyslexia and dyscalculia. And we find that in our analysis, about 30% of the genetic variance is specific to maths. There's also genetic abnormalities. As I say, it's more common in boys. There are X chromosome disorders, which in some cases female only, like Turner syndrome. I mean, all the Turner syndrome subjects that we've tested and other people have tested have got problems with basic numerosity processing. But candidate genes, insofar as anybody has any idea about them, have not been identified in the X chromosome. So I don't really know what's going on here, but we are looking into it. I just want to briefly talk about a twin study which is in progress. It's quite a large twin study for doing what we're doing, but it's a small twin study compared to the kind of large scale studies that Plomin and Kovas do. So this was 104 monozygotic and 56 dizygotic twins. And we gave them about 40. The kids would come into the lab for a day and we'd give them 40 tests and scan their brains. And we found that when you do data reduction using factor analysis, there was one factor, which we call number processing, which consisted of the numerical operations, tests from the wand, addition and subtraction and multiplication, inverse efficiency, and dot enumeration. And we used a statistical mathematical method called Mahalanobis distance to identify outliers from the sample mean on the basis of the numerical dimension of factor 1. And there was a highly significant predictor of dyscalculia as defined by the difference between the 1 numerical operations now using in the Wyatt and IQ following Isaacs. So that's sort of one thing that reassured us. But we also looked at heritability using sort of standard behavioral genetic methods. So we looked at the region of interest in the left parietal lobe, and the abnormality there was moderately heritable. And then we did a multiple analysis using region of interest and Mahalanobis distance for number processing. And again, we found using this kind of extremes analysis, again, it's quite heritable. So the heritability of both the brain area and the relationship between the brain area and our numerical processing is heritable. Details, we don't know what genes are involved, but as I say, we're working on that. Just give you one individual case, what it's like to be dyscalculic, and we have lots of these. I'm very happy if you want to get in touch with me, I'll give you lots of information. This is one student, a 23-year-old student at a top American university. And we asked her, or Eleanor and Beth asked her, can you please tell me the result of 9 times 4? Right, remember, this is a student at a top American university, and she doesn't know, and she's asked to guess, and she says 47. She said, right, I'll write down 47, but you can still change your answer if you want. For example, how about changing it with 36? No, it doesn't seem a better guess than 47, which incidentally is prime. Does it? I'll keep 47. So you're really, really bad at numbers if you're dyscalculic, even if you're very smart. Now, where do we need to be with dyscalculia? Well, there are 3 things I want to stress here. One is a specific test for dyscalculia, not just poor arithmetic, which you could use a standard arithmetic test for. But the test for dyscalculia has to be based on a core deficit in numerosity processing. Then we need specific interventions for dyscalculia based on work with sets. And we also need recognition by authorities and training from professionals, teachers, educational psychologists, and so on. So I'm not going to say anything about 3 really, except that we need this and we don't have it in many countries. So unfortunately, there only seems to be one test, which is actually rather expensive, which is a dyscalculia screener, which we developed years ago based on the study I did with Landell and Anna Bevan. We really need better tests than that because we know a lot more than we did in 20 years ago. And also we need it on diverse populations. We just tested on English kids. And the test looks like this. That there's a basic reaction time test because we wanted to know whether a child was slow on numbers or just slow in general. Because what we're looking at here is not just accuracy, but accuracy and speed. So there's a dot to digit comparison test and a digit comparison test. And this all the measures use inverse efficiency, and which is reaction time divided by percent correct in our population, and we have a performance scale. So you can have a look at addition as being a measure of your accuracy, your performance using this, or multiplication if you're a bit older. And then you've also got our what are called capacity test, dot enumeration, or numerical Stroop. We didn't do the Stroop analysis in this particular study, but it's just number comparison. And so if you're in the normal range on these, you're not dyscalculic. If you're bad at arithmetic, you're bad at arithmetic, but not dyscalculic. And if you are dyscalculic, you're kind of bad on all these areas, both on measures of your arithmetical ability and also on your number comparison and dot enumeration, all adjusted for simple reaction time. So how should we intervene? Well, we have to have pedagogic principles for intervention. So according to the core deficit hypothesis, the key to understanding arithmetic are sets and operations on sets. Therefore, the key to supporting DD learners in school work is linking sets to familiar symbols. We have done this in two ways. We have written guidance for teachers and laid out a scheme by which they can help DD learners, and digital games. I'll talk more about digital games. But the pedagogy has got to follow the standard pedagogical prescriptions. Build a new task on what's been learned, direct attention to salient properties, adapt each task to be just challenging enough, and construct solutions to the tasks. Don't just allow kids to guess from a list of possible answers. So that I won't go through this now, but we published a book on this this was actually written mostly by Dorian Yeo, who was probably the best teacher of dyscalculic kids I've ever come across. Alas, no longer with us. And this is the game that we developed. Really, it's Digital Dorian that I developed with Diana Lorillard in collaboration with a computer company. And you can play this using that particular login. So you log in with your name, and if you don't know how to play the game, there's a little animation guide at the beginning to show you how the game works. And basically, what we go is from sets to eventually to numbers. So we have sets in a kind of sandpit, and you can do things with these sets, like you can split a set, create subsets. So there you've got the split of the set of two, split into two ones, or you could combine sets to make the target. That's the target at the top. And if you get it right, you get a star. And you can define how many stars that the learner needs to get onto the next level. And then we go from this sort of arrangement to sets with the digits attached to them, still using color to help the child. Then we take the color away, but it's basically the same task, but now they're just white numerals. And in the end, you've got just the numerals. And you can actually split the numerals by clicking on them in order to make the target. We also have a control called number choice, which uses a multiple choice question. So you're given 4, and then you have to try and make another 4. So say 1 and then the learner will select one of these and to try and make the answer. So if I just show kids working on this game.
You make the best games in the whole world.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I've done it again.
Excellent. So
Freeman is ready.
You don't actually need to have dragons and bells and whistles and things for kids to be really interested in playing this game. They get their rewards from getting it right. I'll just show this is a remedial numeracy class in a primary school near me, and here they're using it on an iPad, which is much better than using it using a trackpad.
Have you just finished that?
Okay, so all these kids are in remedial numeracy. All of them went all the way through all the levels of the test, apart from one kid who somehow couldn't do it. We've also tested whether this is actually effective. So my student Ines Zerboni, with a small number London sample, which is just 11 dyscalculic kids out of a total sample of 78, found that that actually number beats helped. It helped more than number choice and much more than controls in terms of accuracy. This is errors. So errors go down when you play our game, and they don't seem to go down when you get normal teaching. This is over 6 weeks. So 3 weeks on each game, and then 6 weeks on your control. So it's a very small sample. I mean, it also was very effective for the other kids who weren't dyscalculic. So if you've got something which is good for dyscalculia, it's probably good for other kids as well. We've also got a large Singapore sample, which is in progress. So we've got currently maybe over 1,000 kids. ENI levels, that's the level that the Ministry of Education defines kids at. So 0 level is very bad and level 3 is quite good. This is in primary school, 2nd year. And all the kids seem to have done, at all levels, seem to have done a bit better. Having played just number beads, we only use number beads with these kids. And I'm just waiting for the control measures to show that actually it's better for the kids to be playing the game than not. We've also done a home trial, just playing the game at home, not in the classroom. A reasonable sample with 80 kids playing number beads, 60 kids playing number choice. And they played for about 2.5 hours. Everything's recorded on our server, so we know exactly what was done. We used a standard Italian curriculum-based test called ACMT. And just to cut a long story short, the low attainers playing with number beads improved on calculation accuracy and fluency. Those with a number choice didn't. We don't have a non-game control, which is a pity, but we're going to get some of that relevant data from Hong Kong, I hope. So technology could help by providing a practice environment, a teacher model that adapts to the difficulty of the task to the performance of the learner. It's a personal device to support the learner away from the classroom in learning the concept. And this is important because if all the kids in class can see that you can't do it, that actually is a big disincentive for trying to work on these problems. And also it allows automatic data tracking. So we as scientists can tell what's going on, and we can feed this back to the teachers so they can pick out the kids that are having particular problems, or maybe the kids that are doing particularly well. So the conclusions are, where we are, it's a deficit in the core capacity to process the numerosity of sets. It's easy to identify kids who have this problem. The neural basis of dyscalculia is revealed in abnormalities in numerosity processing parts of the brain. I should just say here that there have been lots of studies of the brains of so-called dyscalculics, usually not just the bottom 5%, but maybe 15% or 30%. And they find all sorts of other differences. But the point is, you have to be able to predict which areas are going to be relevant. Those have to be the areas that we know are relevant to numerosity processing. We also know there's a big impact of developmental dyscalculia, both for education and life chances. I'm not going to go into that today. Some places recognize dyscalculia and tries to provide additional help. So in Italy, you have Law 170. In the US, you have a law called Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but nothing in England. So where we need to be is to have a good, cheap, properly standardized ECTU screener, effective specific interventions based on core deficits and best adaptive pedagogy. Here, educational technology can help. We need to train teachers and educational psychologists. They're not normally trained to spot or to help dyscalculics. And policymakers and educational authorities worldwide need to be able to recognize it. So that's all. Thank you very much for listening, if you have been. And you can go to my website for my papers on dyscalculia. There's a new book in Italian on dyscalculia. And thanks to many people who've been involved in the studies I've talked about in Melbourne, in London, in Cuba, and in Argentina and Singapore. And for the twin studies, the other big group of people, the home trials, Silvia Benavides, Daniela Lucangeli, and Giulio Pipeno inter alia, plus Diana Laurelard. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very inspiring. I think there have been a few questions. Maybe we can answer immediately.
There's one question from Lydia Jimenez Short. This is a very good question for which I don't really have an answer, I'm afraid. There's something going on in the gender difference for these very basic numerical processes. And we did find an unpublished study where we ran dot enumeration in a museum where we had thousands of participants, and in the museum they were given a card when they came in, and when they wanted to play our game they had to put the card in the machine. So we had demographic data, age and gender. And what we found was that in the subitizing range, females were better than males, not in the counting range, just in the subitizing range. So my general hypothesis about these things is that females are better than males at everything. Didn't seem to be the case. And we still don't have a theory about why this should be, but it was a very large sample and it was true across the age range. So there could be something here, but I don't know what it is. So I'm terribly sorry I can't help. So I don't see any other actual questions in the chat box. If anybody has.
How dyscalculia should be understood, interpreted in the context of dementia? I'm not sure. Maybe Lydia can say better what is exactly
about dementia.
Yeah, this is I read in the chat, but I'm not sure what.
Sorry, I didn't see that in the chat. But about dementia, we've done a couple of studies on adults with dementia, and what we found was that dementia can, in one particular case, which we published several papers on, this patient, it wasn't Alzheimer's. This patient had almost no language left, either receptive or productive, but whose calculation was still very much intact, provided that you gave the questions in written form, not in spoken form. So it looks as though, at least in what we call here semantic dementia or progressive aphasia, that you can have this dissociation between language and other cognitive functions on the one hand and mathematical ability on the other. I know that Carlos Amenza in Padova has done some work with mild cognitive impairment, and other, I think, early stage dementias, in which she finds a similar sparing of numerical abilities. But I can't really talk to that. He's the person to ask. Okay, then we can have more discussion at the end of the talks. And now we turn to dyslexia, and I will make a presentation. So I wanted to talk about dyslexia from the perspective of comorbidity. We know a lot of things. You know, there have been lots of papers on dyslexia, but I want to take a very specific slant in terms of comorbidity. And one interesting turning point of this research is on from this paper by Bruce Pennington in 2006,
in which he summarized a lot of research on from his group, emphasizing the multifactorial nature of developmental disorders, including dyslexia. So he actually proposed the idea that we should forget to think to cognitive analysis or also sociological analysis in terms of single deficit, but we should move in thinking that every deficit is multifactorial. And this is expressed in terms of comorbidity. And we know that comorbidity is a very widespread phenomenon. We know that learning disorder are comorbid. Children with dyslexia often, but not always, have dyscalculia. But also the learning disorder are also associated with a variety of additional developmental disorders, such as ADHD or language disorder. And this perspective, I think it was quite interesting and produced a number of research. Here we see the model that was proposed by Prof. Pennington, which tries to put together many different things. First of all, different levels of analysis, as originally proposed by Morton and Fried. So we have etiological risk, neural system, cognitive process, and complex behavioral disorder. And it is at the level of complex behavioral disorder that we observe comorbidity. So that actually there is an overlap between many different disorders. Some of these disorders are we could say, close, or as expressed by Pennington, homotypic, show homotypic comorbidity. There is an association within the same domain. For example, language, in this paper with names, sorry. Pennington describes the association between, for example, reading disability and language impairment or speech sound disorder, and together with Dorothy Bishop, he expresses this association in terms, as you can see, of comorbidity rates. Numbers you see in the slide are the comorbidity rates, how many are much more likely is to have, for example, a reading disorder if you also have a language impairment or a speech sound disorder. And as you can see, the reading disorder is particularly present in the case of children with reading impairment, even if there is no speech sound disorder, while the opposite is not true. Speech sound disorder has a close association with the reading deficits. This perspective is very different from the original, that stemmed from research from Lieberman and Schankweiler, in which the hypothesis was a continuity between language impairment and reading disorder, so that children would first have a language impairment and later would develop a reading disorder. Here we can see that this association are among disorders which are still independent, but the emphasis is the idea to search for which are the common factors among disorders and which are the factors which specifically identify different disorders. Much of the research of the group by Bruce Pennington has focused on an heterotypic comorbidity, that is the association between reading disorder and a disorder in a different domain, that is ADHD. And they've done a lot of research, and I have time to see it all, but essentially they compare group of controls with groups of children who only had the reading disorder or ADHD, or they had both disorders, and the search for the factors which seem to be specific for reading disorders, possibly phoneme awareness, but also the verbal measure, and the factors which are specific for ADHD, possibly response inhibition, and this is the crucial idea, the factors that are common to these two disorders. And the proposal by for example, in this Wilcott study, is the idea that processing speed accounts for the share variance between reading and ADHD. And you can see below that this is confirmed in multiple logistic regression models. So the processing speed accounts for both reading disorder and ADHD. There is also some evidence that this association is due to hereditability, and this is obtained by evidence comparing dizygotic and monozygotic pairs. In fact, a large number of these children. So I think this is a very interesting perspective that emphasizes the idea that we should not search for single causes, but we should also search for factors which are shared between two different developmental disorders. The cognitive factors described by Pennington group are very general. And so in a sense, I thought there would be some loss, they will disregard a very long literature that was being based on cognitive analysis. Here we see, for example, two well-known models, dual root model and triangle model. We had the impression that focusing only on very general cognitive factors would sort of lose the idea that we can actually identify proximal factors that account for behavior, but we only rely on distal factors that account for behavior. And in a paper, actually a couple of papers, we try to see whether we could join these two perspectives and try to develop a proximal model of comorbidity. And so we started to this aim, we made the hypothesis that we wanted to predict different behavior, not just reading, but reading as well as spelling and maths. But we wanted to try to see whether it would be possible to put together all the available information on the cognitive dimension that actually specifically predict these behaviors. So we identify a number of cognitive dimensions based on the literature, our reading of the literature, there could be different ideas, and tasks that would map on this cognitive dimension, and try to see whether we could make a model, not of just reading, but a model of both reading, spelling, and maths, sort of ambitious goal. And this prediction you see here based on our reading of the literature. And we made a very simple experiment, which on top you can see the dependent measure, that is a text reading test, a spelling to dictation test, mental calculation test, a written arithmetic calculation test. And these are some of the predictors we use, and that are based on the model we saw before, and then we compare with general predictors. We look at predictors like nonverbal intelligence, or for speech span, or verbal fluency. The predictor you see first is important, the symbol search subtest, because this is the predictor that was used in the studies by Bruce Pennington and colleagues as a key cognitive factor accounting for the overlap between different factors. Okay. And we examine a number of typically developing children in 5th grade with a lot of tests. And these are the results. The basic approach was to examine through commonality analysis whether we could develop a model, a specific model with the predictors based on our hypothesis. I don't have time to go into the details, and compare these specific models with models based on general factors. And for example, in the case of reading time, a specific model accounts for 48% of variance rather than 19% of variance. And this, I'm not going to go through the details, but you can see that also in the case of spelling, 29 against 6, computation speed, 37 against 12, and computation accuracy, 27 against 12. So we could confirm some of the hypotheses, and in general, the models based on specific predictors were more effective than the models on general factors. And here we see some of the links summarized. So this is the empirical data, not the hypothesis. And this is partly satisfactory, but we should also see very broadly that all the predictors that account for reading and spelling are separate from the predictors that account for math. So essentially, we see that there is no overlap as predictor. And you can see that the predictors of math are, one key factor is, as expressed by Brian Butterworth, is a task of number order to topic dimensional number representation. Okay, so we went ahead and tested whether what happens if we switch predictors over dependent measures. Essentially, what happens is presented in this slide. If I use a predictor based on reading, I can predict reading speed by 48% of variance. This is variance. These are general variance accounted for by the model, by the commonality model. So with reading speed, I can account for 48% of variance. This is very high. But we found that if you use the predictors of the calculation model, which are entirely different from the one of the reading, you can actually predict 38% of variance of the reading speed model. And this is way more than what happens if you use the predictors of the cognitive abilities, which is 19%. And this is generally true. For example, if you use the predictors of reading speed, you can account for accuracy in writing for 21% of variance, rather than the 29% of variance accounted for by the model of writing accuracy. So these data tell us that the high specificity that seems to be obtained in the first analysis is not entirely true. You can predict reading using the predictors of calculation. And we did some additional, more detailed analysis that I don't have time to present. And we found that there were essentially three behaviors in the different predictors. Some predictors influence all behavior. Some predictors on the right predicted only one behavior, and some were some predictors were influencing between, predicting only some parameters. So, for example, they only predicted speed or accuracy. This means that some tests, like a test of arithmetic facts, a test of orthographic decision, deciding whether the orthographic form of a word was actually correct or not, which requires lexical knowledge, could be interchanged. So you can actually predict reading with an orthographic decision test, but also with an arithmetic facts tests and vice versa. On the right, you can see, however, that there are also predictors that are rather specific. Some predictors, the ability to match visual auditory pseudo words with very specific for reading, and repetition of single pseudo words was very specific of writing, and number of the tests was very specific of calculation, which is consistent with what Brian has described before. So we thought that to make a more general model, we should actually imagine factors on a more general perspective. And this slide is complex, but I want to, it largely focuses on the contrast between competence and performance. You can see on the left. That was originally proposed by Noam Chomsky. Competence is a domain-independent, task-independent ability to activate a specific set of representation. And Brian described his proposal for competence on arithmetic task based on numerosity. And the key factor of competence is task independent, but we know that every measure we take from children is also partly dependent on the task, and this is traditionally task referred to performance. We propose a third level of analysis based on acquisition. And practice is important to learn the rules and the regularities in reading and writing, and to adjust to the typical task formats like reading and text from left to right. But there is a specific component which is activating direct memory trace, which is the factor which we think it doesn't easily fall into the dichotomy between competence and performance. And so we thought to separate this acquisition level. And the hypothesis that we make based on this data is that the acquisition of direct memory traces is domain independent and may help to account for comorbidity. This we propose to a model that has been proposed by Gordon Logan, essentially Logan has proposed that learning occurs through a passage from an algorithm to an instance-based knowledge, and he provided many evidence of this, and an important part of this theory is that this learning occurs following a power function shape. Actually, we found that this is very clear in the case of reading. These are cross-sectional data that show that the learning of reading speed occurs following very clearly a power function. You can see the black dots are the median values, but as predicted by the Logan's theory, also every part of the distribution follows a power function, so including children who are very fast and children who are very slow. One interesting feature of this data is that if we look at the difference between children in the 90 percentile, so that are slow against the children who are in the middle of the distribution, we can see that the differences seem to get smaller with age. But actually, if we look at the distance from these children with their in terms of temporal lag, we can see the opposite. That is, that children actually become the effect is gets bigger with age. You know, the terms, if you take children who are in second grade, they're only delayed by, who are slow readers, they're only delayed by approximately 1 year. But if we take children in 8th grade, we can see that they're delayed to typically developing children by about 3 years. And this is actually what has been found in some research. Okay, yeah, sorry. For example, we examine spelling impairments in Italian children, and we compare children in 3rd grade and 5th grade, and it's very clear that lexical deficit, the inability to spell unpredictable words which have an unpredictable spellings, is much more evident in 5th grade than in 3rd grade. So some of the predictions based on the Leuven model are proven by additional research, and we try to make a model that would incorporate these 3 levels of analysis. So we and this is an example applied to reading. For example, we can imagine that there is a competence. Here it's proposed that it's an orthographic phonological binding, a performance, and this of course is just an hypothesis. Performance is associated with use of contextual information or integration of read components, ability to integrate, to read left to right, and to, in an effective way, to use eye movements. But if you look on the right, the lower right, also an ability in consolidating instances, the ability to know the specific lexical information on specific words. And this model of reading, we thought could be interesting, because it could be expanded to be used with, to incorporate information for all the different learning skills. So we could actually predict the different behaviors, reading fluency, speed in making calculation and writing a text, in terms of these 3 factors. One is competence. For example, in the case as described by Brian, we can imagine a number, numerosity competence as a base, as a critical base for performing mental calculation, but also a number of performance factors and the ability to know specific instances. For example, arithmetic facts are important in making calculation, but lexical knowledge is important in reading, and in the case of the regular orthography, such as Italian, particularly in spelling words with unpredictable spelling. So this model emphasized the idea that the comorbidity between different learning disorder might be linked to a general incapacity to consolidate instances across different domains. And we made a couple of additional studies to do this. We recently published this paper in Brain Sciences on the network analysis of the relationship between reading, spelling, and math. This is a study using regular clinical tests, and we can see that these results on the left, it's the same results at different thresholds. On top, you can see all the links between different tests using a network analysis, and on the bottom you see only the major links. And the fact that and it's very clear from these results that there is an association between tests in the same domain, for example, in among mathematical skills, among reading tests, and among spelling tests, which are also marked by different colors. But there are some critical tests that are a link between these different domains, and as predicted, these tests like arithmetic facts or spelling ambiguous words, which rely on the knowledge of specific instances. So we think that these tests based on clinically valid measures supports the idea that comorbidity could be particularly associated with the domain general factor on instance acquisition. And here we see some more results on this, and particularly the diagonal. You can see the critical factor is the strength centrality index, and you can see that the strength centrality index, the idea that these tests based on instance knowledge, like arithmetic facts, have a very strong centrality index, are highly predict all the tests. Okay, I want to present an additional research we have completed recently, not yet published, on the study of acquisition of instances in children, and how this can predict performance on various reading, spelling, and math tasks. In the literature, we know that there are recent studies on learning. For example, you can see some studies made by Ellis, Young, Poetos groups, and also by Haas. Many of these studies used repeated presentation of pseudo words and non-words, and typically they observed that the length effect, which characterize the initial performance in reading pseudo words, is reduced in controls. It doesn't reduce well in children with dyslexia. For example, if you look at the bottom left, you can see the data by Suarez Koala, and you can see that the children with control children, the difference between short and long pseudo words reduces after practice, while the difference between short and long pseudo words does not reduce after practice in children with dyslexia. And these studies are generally consistent with the idea that typically developing children are able to construct new lexical items upon repeated presentation, while children with dyslexia still show a length effect after long practice. And so this can be interpreted as an inability to form a new orthographic representation. In our terms, this would mean that the children have difficulty in forming an instance, a specific knowledge about a specific item. Okay, so we have recently completed a study that they still published with some colleagues here in Rome and in Lecce, and we use a task, a very simple task, so that you see here, and the child has to learn a new rule, a rule that doesn't probably never apply. It's just something entirely new. So B plus 2 is equal D. So the children will
Pierluigi, sorry to interrupt. We are still seeing the slide with the different papers.
I was afraid that the problem. So this is the research I was describing, and this is the task I was telling you about. So you have a letter, and the child has to write the 2 letters ahead in the alphabet. So B plus 2 would be D, A plus 2 would be C, and so on. So in doing this task repeatedly, we'll start using the algorithm, but following the Leuven theory, it should get better following a power function, and this practice would essentially be due to the ability to learn specific instances. And you can see that the results follow this hypothesis fairly well. The children get better through 20 repetitions. Here it's not shown, but if you change the specific items in the 20, in one additional presentation, children get much worse. So this is in keeping with the idea that learning is instance specific, okay? And we ran about 140 children. 3 were excluded because of low Leuven performance, and a few were excluded because the individual power function were not very clear, below 60.60 in terms of variance. But many of these children, 91%, could be tested with the individually reliable power functions, and we correlated these power functions with lots of tests. And this slide is complex, but I'll try to make it simple. Our prediction would be that children with good skills in learning in instances, in instance-based tasks, would be better in tasks which are related to the acquisition of instances, like orthographic decision, deciding whether a lexical form is correct, writing words with unpredictable mapping, performing arithmetic facts tests or simple multiplications. And actually, we use the parameters in the power function, that is the scaling parameters. There are 2 scaling parameters and the exponent to predict this test. And the crucial result is that this skill on learning actually predicts well both orthographic decision, both writing unpredictable words with unpredictable mapping, and arithmetic facts. And you can see here the fact that the general model, these are multiple regression analysis. The scaling parameters tell us about the asymptote, I mean the limit for performance, and crucially, the difference between initial and asymptotic performance. You can see that this skill does not predict a number of tasks as we predicted. For example, it does not predict the capacity to write pseudo words, which would be a performance which is controlled by an algorithm, not by instances, and a number of math tasks that are also like judgment of numbers or number orders, which will not be predicted to be learned on specific instances, but to represent a core competency in mathematics. And finally, this capacity is unrelated to general factor like digispan or nonverbal intelligence. So we propose that these recent unpublished data are consistent with the idea that part of the comorbidity is that we observe among learning tasks is due to an individual domain general capacity to acquire specific instances, which is consistent with the general model of learning proposed by Gordon Logan. Okay, I just want to mention that this is a little bit of research on comorbidity, but I would like also to mention that the perspective, comorbidity perspective, had a role in somehow changing the way we look at the learning disorders, also in clinical international manuals. We know that, for example, the DSM-4, IECBS2021 were very much focused on a separate, isolated, or so-called specific disorders. So we have in DSM-4 reading, math, written expression, and in ICD-10 reading, spelling, or disorder or arithmetic skills, and so on. But we know that the DSM-5 has changed this very much, and there is an interesting paper by Rosemary Tannock, which describes the reason how the group, the reference group for the DSM reached this proposal. And you can see that the crucial point was the questionable discreteness of the categories of the DSM-4. And so the research on comorbidity had a very strong impact also on the way we look clinically. And as you know, in the DSM-5, there is only a single specific learning disorder with a number of specifiers, but this is an attempt, it looks like an attempt to incorporate the current knowledge on comorbidity into the clinical practice. And I will stop here.
So you have a couple of questions in the Q&A box.
Some people should dyslexia only when writing order for languages. Is it just the result of what of which diction? Tell you the truth, I'm not sure that I notice in our children we don't see so much of a difference between reading in Italian and reading in other languages. Usually reading other languages is exceedingly difficult for dyslexic children, but this seems more like a matter of severity than qualitative differences. But I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure I have a definite answer for this. What kind of guidelines for psychoeducational intervention in the classroom? Well, I feel that this is a complex question to answer. I'm not sure I have a final answer. Our attempt is to try to integrate knowledge of different learning disabilities, which can be interpreted at different levels. So my general perspective would be that if a child has a difficulty in a core competence, you need to tackle that specific disorder. And Brian Butterworth has described deficit in the core competence of numerosity in the case of Dyscalculia. And we know that children with, for example, a core deficit in phonology and spelling, for example. So you wanted to focus on that, on the core competence, but our proposal is that there are also additional deficits with the difficulty in acquiring specific instances, in acquiring arithmetic facts, in acquiring lexical knowledge, lexical items in reading and in writing. And so this would require very different educational intervention, very different, because you want to practice children with specific instances and not with algorithms. So my general perspective is to try to interpret the disturbances as they are related to competence factors or to instance-based processing. So that would be my general answer. I guess I spoke a little bit too much, and I'm sorry for Maaike, but we are ready to listen to your presentation, and please go ahead.
Okay, thank you all. All right, okay, so I will talk today about brain dynamics across reading development in children with typical reading skills and dyslexia. I will mainly focus on the structural aspects of the brain, so more on the white matter properties and the volume of the gray matter, for example, and see how that relates to reading development and what is maybe different in persons with dyslexia. And we mainly focus on the early development, but really try to follow up these children across primary school. So let me first start maybe with giving you some overview on the neural basis of reading. So if you look at functional MRI studies, which are often done in older children or adults, then we see that there is a left lateralized network involved. So there's also some involvement of the right, but it's clearly dominant in the left. And then you see a bit of two roots. So you see the dorsal root, which includes like regions such as STG, angular gyrus, SMG, and together this temporoparietal region, together with inferior frontal regions, they would be involved in reading by letter or grapheme to phoneme coupling, so that you really read the word grapheme per grapheme. Whereas if you have more a direct word recognition, you would use more this ventral root originating from the ventral occipital temporal region, which also hosts the visual word form area. And so here, this more ventral root you would use more when you more rely on this direct word recognition, just based on the orthographic form of the word. So this is what we see in adults. If we then look also to studies on dyslexia, so we had already a very nice explanation by Professor Zoccolotti about dyslexia, so I don't need to go into detail about what is dyslexia. But at the brain level, what we see is that in functional MRI studies, they have less activation of certain regions of this reading network, and especially these posterior regions are less involved. So they show less activation. In the frontal region, they show a bit like both hyper and hypoactivation, but there is some clear differences within that left reading network in persons with dyslexia. But of course, this is functional data. Do we also see structural differences? So if we look at diffusion MRI studies, so this technique is really made to capture these white matter connections in the brain. So as you saw on the previous slide, reading involves different distant regions. So they are connected with the white matter or by the white matter pathways, such as the arcuate fasciculus, which is more the dorsal network, and also the IFOF, which is connecting the region more in a ventral way. The arcuate fasciculus also consists of different components, but especially this green one, the long segment, has been shown to be impaired in persons, adults with dyslexia. So there's also at the structural level, you see some differences between typical readers and persons with dyslexia, adults in this case. And also in terms of gray matter volume, we also see within that reading network we saw on the previous slide, we see differences in dyslexic readers. So both in these more dorsal temporoparietal regions as also in this ventral region. But of course, we see these differences in adults. So it's when you take a picture of an adult brain, but it's not a guarantee that you will also see these differences at an earlier age, because reading is something that is relatively a recent cultural invention. If you see that in ancient Greek, around 2000 years ago, our reading system was invented. So our brain is not genetically programmed for reading. So what we do, in fact, is when you learn to read and write, you have to use existing neural systems and you need to reorganize them in order to read and write. So it's something that really requires some reorganization. So in that perspective, it's also important to know how this reorganization is occurring, because there is not a lot of studies currently on these developing aspects of this reading network at the brain level. And also with regard to dyslexia, the differences we observed in the adults, they might just be a result of having less reading exposure or a different way of reading. And this is then maybe causing the differences. So I think in that perspective, it's important to go to look at the brain of children really at the onset of reading and follow them up throughout reading developments. Because of course, reading involves a lot of different aspects, a lot of things are ongoing. Even before you start to read and write, there are some important precursors of reading, such as phonological awareness, letter knowledge. And then when you start to read and write, in the beginning, as I said, you really do it more like using the grapheme to phoneme coupling roots. So you really focus on decoding the words. Whereas after certain years, you can do it more and more automatically. You will more directly recognize the words, and you will also increase the speed so that the focus can become more on the content of what you read instead of the reading process itself. And then there is a bit of stabilization in adolescence, although there is still an increase in speed of reading, of course. But there's a lot of things going on in this period of primary school. So I think it's also important to have a look at the brain, how that is then changing throughout this period. And with regard to dyslexia, it's maybe also important to note that currently in clinical practice, the typical window for intervention is often from grades 2 to 3 onwards. And the reason for that is that one of the diagnostic criteria for dyslexia is that it's a persistent deficit. So, so at least here in Belgium, in Flanders, children need to show like a persistent deficit. So you have to wait until they fail a couple of times, and only then the diagnosis can be given. And this is a bit in contrast with literature showing that interventions which occur in an earlier time window, so even preventive interventions in kindergarten or beginning of grade 1, that these interventions are more effective than when they occur later in development. So this is what they call the dyslexia paradox, that although we know it's probably more efficient to provide interventions early on in the clinical practice, we provide interventions later on. And I think also there it's important to know at the brain level what is happening. Are our brains more plastic in this early window than in the later window? And can this maybe explain why we see a more effective intervention window earlier in time? So what I will focus on today is mainly, I have split them in 3 main components. So we did some studies first on pre-reading markers of dyslexia, because as I said, what we saw in the adults, we cannot assume that this also that the same deficits are present already at a very young age. And so it's very important to know which of these deficits are important pre-reading, because that might indicate that they are a cause of the later reading problems. Whereas if we see some deficits only occurring later in time, then this is more maybe a compensation or a consequence of less reading. So it's maybe not at a cause or at the basis of the reading deficits. So therefore we will look pre-reading, so in children. And then a second thing we will do is we will also follow up these children throughout their reading development, throughout primary school. So we can also see how is their brain changing, and is that different from typical readers. So we can compare the neurodevelopment of the dyslexic readers versus the typical readers. And then finally, I will also present some more preliminary, also more recent results we have from our intervention study, where we did a preventive intervention study. So we will start to do intervention in kindergarten, and then we can also look at how this brain is changing. Because of course it's important, if we find early deficits in persons with dyslexia at their brain level, for example, before they start to read and write, it's also important to know, can we, are these deficits malleable? Can we maybe restore the reading network, or is it a deficit that remains present? So these three things I will tackle in the studies that I will present now. So with regard to the pre-reading markers, just a brief summary of previous studies. So we did an attempt to summarize in a meta-analysis previous studies on pre-readers with a risk for dyslexia. And then we saw that indeed in these studies, across these studies, we found it mainly in the left, again, some differences between children who are at risk for dyslexia. So meaning they have either a family risk for dyslexia, such as a parent who has dyslexia, or they had a cognitive risk. So they score very low on typical precursors of reading, such as phonological awareness or letter knowledge. So we already see some deficit, but of course this is a very, a bit of a rough summary, because first of all, we just assimilated studies with all different types of MRI modalities, but also very important, these studies did not have a classification of who eventually developed dyslexia. So in these pre-readers with the risk for dyslexia, some of them will develop dyslexia, but some others will not. So it's therefore also important to really know, okay, what are now the differences that really predict who will develop dyslexia, and not just are cohering with the risk for dyslexia. So therefore we started, it's almost 10 years ago, we started a project, a longitudinal project, where we started with pre-readers, of whom half had a family risk for dyslexia, meaning they had a first-degree relative with a diagnosis of dyslexia. And then we searched in the class of that child for a child with no family risk, and who was of the same gender, also the same class, so they were nicely matched to each other. And these children were behaviorally tested, so they did some reading precursors tasks, but they were also scanned with an MRI, so we could have a look at their brain. I will mainly discuss the structural results of that study. We had data, MRI data of 72 children, and then we followed them up throughout development. So also we had a scan when they were at the end of second grade, and we also had a scan when they were more or less in the middle of grade 5. And given that we also followed them up behaviorally, so we have a lot of behavioral tests of these children throughout development, including, of course, reading and spelling tests. So based on this longitudinal data that we acquired on literacy in grade 2, grade 3, and grade 4, we could reclassify our subjects, our participants. So we could see, okay, who of our sample eventually developed dyslexia and who eventually developed typical reading skills. At the end, we had 15 to 20 children who developed dyslexia. The numbers depend a bit on which modality, MRI modality we investigated and which time points. So it's a sample of dyslexic readers around 15 to 20, sorry, and then around 50 or 40 to 50 typical readers. And so for the first part of today, I will focus on these pre-reading MRI measures, but I will use a classification based on the longitudinal literacy data. So I can have a look at how the brain looks like of children who are pre-readers who eventually develop dyslexia. So if we look at the white matter, so we looked again at the same tracts as we also investigated in the adults. So we had a look at the arcuate, so the dorsal tract, and also the ventral IFOF. And what we saw is that, so you see here per tract or per subsegment of the tract, You see the comparison between normal or typical readers, more in the dark color, and the dyslexic readers. And if you remember, in the adults, we saw that dyslexic adults, they had different white matter organization in this green tract, so the long segment of the arcuate fasciculus. They only had it in the left. We see the same at the pre-reading age, but we also saw a difference in the right, which we expected maybe less than the left difference. And in the other segments and also in the ventral tract, we did not see a difficulty or difference in dyslexic pre-readers. We also did some logistic regression where we predicted who will develop dyslexia based on the behavioral outcomes together with the brain outcomes. And then only the left arcuate fasciculus, so the long segment again, was predictive and not the right anymore. So there was, we did find some group differences in both the left and the right, but there was a bit of a dominance in terms of prediction for the left. If we look at the gray matter, we looked at specific regions that have been found or that were found in previous studies. And we found that the fusiform gyrus, so which is in this ventral occipital region, so which also hosts the visual worldroom area, there we found some differences in the pre-readers who developed dyslexia, but again, both in the left and the right. But also here, when we did a whole brain analysis, so when we looked at all the regions of the brain, not only the reading-related regions, the left fusiform was confirmed, but the right wasn't. So it means that it was statistically a bit less strong in the right than it was in the left. So that's for the pre-reading markers. We also had a look at differences related to the family risk. So regardless or whether or not they developed dyslexia, also the family risk readers showed some differences, mainly in the bilateral temporal regions. We saw it with the structural T1 measures, we saw it with diffusion measures, we even saw it with fMRI. So this means that at the brain level, we see children who are at risk for dyslexia, we see some widespread differences, but in order to eventually develop dyslexia, it's especially this arcuate fasciculus what is important and the fusiform gyrus. So to conclude about these pre-reading measures, we see indeed there is already a deficit in the left reading network before they start to read and write in children with dyslexia. We see it in the arcuate fasciculus, which was also confirmed in other studies that also occurred at the same time as ours. And we also see it in the left fusiform, which is also confirmed in another fMRI study, for example. So this seems to suggest that the deficits we see is not just a consequence of the reading failure, it's really there already from the start. We did see it also in the right, a bit less consistent, but of course there were some differences there as well, which was maybe a bit less expected than the left differences. And concerning the family risk, we also see some widespread differences, but it's not sufficient to develop dyslexia. So in order to develop dyslexia, you also need to have this deficit in the arcuate fasciculus and in the fusiform in the left. Okay, so I hope I still have time to go to the next two pillars of the presentation. So the second one is on the trajectories of the neural trajectories in typical and in dyslexic readers. As I said, previous studies have shown, at least at the functional level, that when children start to read and write, there is some reorganization in the brain that, for example, in this ventral occipital region, that some of the voxels which were previously not well specialized, when you start to read and write, they really start to specialize for literacy. And if you would have no schooling, then they would have specialized for other visual categories such as tools or faces and so on. And also in the dorsal regions, we see some reorganization when you start to read and write. Of course, these studies really focus only on these very first stages of reading development. And we know reading development is really something that is occurring throughout primary school. So there's no information on these later stages. And also it's functional. So we were not sure, can we also see some structural changes occurring across reading development that are not just a maturation of results, but maybe induced by learning to read and write. if you look at previous studies at the literature, you see there are some large-scale studies that have had a look at gray matter changes in volume across development, but there's always very little information on this early time window. So there's a lot of subjects in this time window, but what we see at the level of the whole brain, there you see the gray matter is maybe stable, but regional differences occur. So some regions have an increase, others have a decrease in gray matter volume. Therefore, on average, at the whole brain level, you see a stable gray matter. But it's important to know there is some regional increases and decreases, and we don't know how that is relating to specific reading stages, and whether this is different in children with dyslexia. With regard to previous studies on white matter, there the pattern is a bit different. So at the whole brain level, we saw for gray matter, it's stable. For white matter, it's increasing in the window of primary school. Also, when you look at specific tracts, such as the arcuate fasciculus, and you look how the white matter is organized, they're also in the fractional anisotropy, which is an index of this white matter organization. You see there's an increase also there throughout primary school. But also here there is very little information on how are these neurotrajectories in dyslexia. There is one study at the time when we started our study that showed that there is maybe a different trajectory in the arcuate fasciculus. So remember, this is a tract where we also observed pre-reading differences. So here they seem to suggest that the good readers, they have a more rapid increase in this arcuate fasciculus than the poor readers. But also here it's only a very short time frame, only the first year of reading development that was captured. And also these children were not yet classified as having dyslexia or not having dyslexia, because it was based on one time point for reading. So therefore we want to investigate these neural trajectories a bit better. And we had the data not only at the end of grade 2, but also at the end of grade 5. And as I said, we had the classification based on the reading scores and literacy and spelling scores of the in grades 2, 3, 4, and 5. Concerning white matter, what did we find? So we see that FA in general is increasing across these time periods of primary school. Of course, we cannot disentangle whether this is just maturation or whether it's really induced by reading. Therefore, we need intervention studies like I will present later. But anyhow, the original deficit we found in the left arcuate fasciculus, so in the green tract. We did some additional analysis to pinpoint where exactly is this deficit found. So you see it here in red. And then we investigated, does this deficit remain present across primary school? And so at each of the 3 time points, the deficit was still there. So there was no difference in the neurotrajectory. So there was no catching up of the dyslexic readers, but also no increase of the gap. It seems to be the deficit was present at a very early start, and it remained present throughout primary school. When we look at gray matter, yeah, maybe important here to know a bit how will we interpret these differences. So as I said, you can, or I didn't say it yet, but you can expect an inverted U-shaped form in terms of maturation for gray matter. So because we know that I showed you already that in primary school, there is more of a stable gray matter at the whole brain level. You see no volume increase or decrease at the whole brain level in primary school. But we also know that in infancy and in the earlier years, there is an increase in the volume of gray matter. And that's because there is extra connections that are generated, myelination as well. And it's only after primary school, so starting from 10 to 12 years, you have the decrease in the volume due to synaptic pruning. And so we can assume that at the regional level, we will also be able to see such an inverted shape with an increase in gray matter volume indicating an earlier state of maturation, and the decrease is probably indicating that you're already in a later state of maturation. So what we did is we had a look at how the brain is changing across the whole brain, but we looked at the regional level. So, and we were looking at how is this going in the early stage grades, so from kindergarten until grade 2. And then we see there is yeah, of course, at the whole brain level, as expected, we did not see a gray matter change. But if we look at specific regions, then we see that in this early reading stage, in this very first years of reading acquisition, you see an increase in the volume, especially in these tract in the regions in the left, regions that belong to the reading network. So that's very pronounced. So you see it here in red on the brain images, and it was not there on the right. And also during that reading stage, you saw also decreases in the volume in more perceptual regions of the visual cortex, for example. So these are probably already more mature than these regions belonging to the reading network. In then the stage between grade 2 and grade 5, there we see again a stable gray matter volume at the whole brain level. But if we look at the regions, you see here now more an increase in more frontal regions, which also makes sense that because in these later grades it's more about reasoning, so maybe more involvement of the frontal regions, and then a further decrease in many of the regions, perceptual and visual regions. So that's maybe important to know that during this early reading stage, we see most of the changes in the reading network occurring and more stabilization in the later stages. Now, how is it then in children with dyslexia? Do they show the same neurodevelopment or some differences? Well, we see in the left reading network itself, there were no differences. So they had the same pace of development, but we did see in the right some differences. So in right IFG, we see that dyslexic, they have an increase in gray matter volume during this early reading stage, so from from kindergarten to grade 2. And in the later stage, in the advanced reading stage from grade 2 to grade 5, they had also some some deviances in the development of some right regions. So these were observed outside of the reading network. So what we conclude from these neurotrajectories is that concerning the typical neurotrajectories, we see there's a white matter increase in the white matter tracts across primary school. For gray matter, it's more regional differences. So some regions increase during this early stage of reading, so the very first 2 years. And these are especially the regions belonging to the left reading network. So this could maybe indicate there's maybe a natural window of plasticity for reading in these very early stages of reading. And this is, of course, a bit contradictory to the current clinical practice where we only provide interventions later on. So maybe when this window of plasticity has already closed a bit, so which makes it probably more difficult to really induce changes in this reading network. Concerning children with dyslexia, so they followed the typical trajectory in terms of interventions. So in these children, often the interventions took place after grade 3, and we see in these children that throughout primary school, the development within that left reading network is the same as the typical readers, but they do show some differences. So the deficits remain present, but they do show some differences, sorry, in the right, in some right regions. So maybe as a way to compensate for their reading difficulties. I see it's already 12 o'clock, so maybe a question to the organizer. Can I maybe just summarize the final pillar and not go into detail?
Yeah,
all right.
Go ahead.
All right. So I'll just go maybe to the study itself. So just a brief, to summarize it briefly. So we did a preventive intervention. So we did a reading intervention with a tablet in kindergartens. So we had 30, I will only discuss the MRI data just before this intervention and directly afterwards. We had around 30 pre-readers and they played grapho game. We adjusted it a bit so that it was possible for the pre-readers to do the game. And then we had an active control group who played Lego games. So very similar in terms of amount they played the intervention, but it was not reading related. And then we also had a group of children who were not at risk, because both of these intervention groups, they had a risk for dyslexia based on cognitive precursors. And then because this was just done as a reference, so they had no intervention, typical reading skills, or no cognitive risk for dyslexia. And so we compared these 3 groups. what we observed is that, this is at the behavior level, so it's indicated that our intervention was working because that group had an increase in letter knowledge. But in terms of MRI data, we saw, I'll just skip this one, we saw in one part, the white matter tract of the left reading network, we saw that children who were at risk, they had indeed a lower organization of the white matter in this pathway relative to the controls. We also observed it, by the way, in the arcuate fasciculus, so that finding was confirmed. But so in the ILF, so ventral tract, we also found a deficit. And we see that the children who followed the reading intervention, they catch up, whereas the Lego game group did not catch up. So we were able to induce some changes in this left reading network, and not only for the white matter, but also for the gray matter. So when we looked also there, we see that the volume of the gray matter within this reading network is increasing for the grapho game group or for the reading intervention group, and that was not the case for the ones played the Lego game or for just the typical controls having no intervention and no risk. So although it's still preliminary results, it seems to show that if we provide the intervention early on in kindergarten, we did see some plasticity that was specific to the intervention within the left reading network, which we didn't see with the longitudinal study where the children with dyslexia just followed the typical interventions which occurred later in time, because there we did not see any differences or catching up in the reading network. So this was just the summary of it all. So at the pre-reading stage, we see some differences in the arcuate fasciculus. We saw that in the longitudinal study, but also in the intervention study. And also in the fusiform, you see some differences. In terms of trajectories, if we just have the usual follow-up of these children, they did not have a specific intervention, but of course the dyslexic children, they were followed up by a speech and language pathologist, but we did not see any differences in this left reading network. Maybe because these interventions took place only after grade 2, whereas we show with our gray matter findings that there is more plasticity in these very first 2 years of reading instruction. But we did see with the preventive reading intervention, so in pre-readers at risk for dyslexia, we were able to show some plasticity within that left reading network. So I think just an important note that there is a need for large-scale studies, especially to look at the dynamics between the behavior level and the MRI level, because we were not able to do that because of our small sample size. And I want to thank all the colleagues who helped with this project, and also all of you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Maaike, for beautiful presentation and exciting data. Let's see whether we have some, maybe we are running a little longer. Okay.
Can I ask a live question? I haven't quite got the Q&A working properly. I mean, I thought that was a series of fantastic studies. And of course, what I think about is whether one could do the same thing for dyscalculia. And obviously, you know,
that was easy to predict this proposal.
Not hard to do. I mean, we've seen in some samples you get these differences, certainly in grey matter. We've done a little bit on white matter, but not very much. But you know, yours is a really big project because it's over several years, with lots of kids, special brain scanning arrangements for kids. But I mean, it would be really interesting if we could intervene early, like you suggest for dyslexia. I mean, we could save a lot of kids an awful lot of heartache. And so I think, as you point out, you know, the practical implications of what you're doing, I mean, I think are really important. And so I suppose the question is, how would you like to have a go at doing this for dyscalculia? That's really the question.
Yeah, I agree. It would definitely be interesting to also do it for dyscalculia. We did, but only after a few years in the project. In the longitudinal project, we also collected some data on calculation, just to make, because we indeed had also the question about how specific are our findings, because we know there is a lot of comorbidity between dyslexia and dyscalculia, so we have no idea to what extent are we really seeing patterns which are specific to dyslexia, or is it just also the same for children with dyscalculia? Of course, our sample is too small to really subdivide. I mean, in having both disorders, one of the two. We did control once for we did find some correlations between reading and some of the white matter tracts, and they maintain present also when you control for the arithmetic tasks. So that's one thing, but it's very, the difficulty with linking the behavioral data to the brain data is that we currently have, our sample is at the end too small to do it. We're now working on scaling up the studies. So that's one thing. So we have the longitudinal study. We are now doubling the sample size with a second cohort, just to have a bit more data to look at dynamics between the different levels. And also maybe of relevance is that in collaboration with Professor De Smet, who is also an expert in dyscalculia, we're now having setting up a new study also in pre-readers, where we will use a school cutoff design. So we will have an MRI scan of children who are just before they go to primary school, and we only scan the youngest children of that of kindergarten. So they're born at the end of the year, and we do the same for children born at the beginning of the year of 1 year earlier. So they are in age, they're very close, and then we will do a second scan. But one group will have had reading instruction and also arithmetic will be learned, whereas the other group will still be in kindergarten. So then we can compare. So they will be very close in age because we have the youngest and the oldest of 1 year, 1 grade older. And then we can really see what is now the changes due to maturation and what is now really due to the school environment. And then but I think, yeah, I'm not sure whether we will be able to find very specific effects of reading versus arithmetic. I think there will be a lot of overlap, but we will have the data to have a look at that.
Sure. I mean, that's reading and arithmetic. That's not dyslexia and dyscalculia.
No, yeah.
And I mean, one of the differences between reading and arithmetic is, at least according to me, and maybe not according to Bert de Smet, is that you're born with a specialized number module, which we share with many other creatures, maybe all other creatures, because all creatures need to be able to read the language of the universe, which is, of course, we know numerical. So there'll be something, I mean, we know that kids, even before they go to school, have some kind of number sense. Even newborns have some kind of number sense. What we don't know is whether there are kids who don't have number sense when they're very young. I mean, no one's done that study. But that leads to, you know, two possibilities. One is you test young kids who, I mean, preschool kids who have poor number sense, and you see, look at their neural trajectory, plus the effects of intervention, which I'm very excited about now. Or you use some other way of making the selection. Now, you looked at families at risk. So presumably, you know, families where they've got dyslexic parents.
Yeah, in the longitudinal study, it was families, or it was children who had a family risk. But in the intervention study, we did a very large cognitive screening in more than 1,000 children. And then we only included the ones who had a cognitive risk. So they had to score below percentile 30 on some cognitive measures. Because these are the kids we assume needed more than so we had, yeah, depending on the study, we have defined it in several ways.
But you didn't use genetic screening.
No, yeah, that's always a missing link, I think, in our data. I worked together with Professor Gisquère for the behavioral data. He's an expert at the cognitive level, and I mainly do the brain analysis, but we have no genetic data in our samples. No,
but it's I mean, of course, there's lots of studies of kind of genetic markers for dyslexia. I mean, you know, smaller percentage of the variance, but anyway, significant. We don't really know about dyscalculia. I mean, there have been some studies which have failed to replicate for the genetics. But now you must, I'm going to say something and you mustn't laugh, okay? Do you promise not to laugh?
I'll do my best.
You have to promise not to laugh. Is that we're looking for the genetic markers of dyscalculia in zebrafish. Okay, so are there particular genes or gene mutations which make zebrafish dyscalculic? And good, you didn't laugh. So we're making some progress on that by looking at candidate genes, basically knockout preparations, and seeing whether they can do the number of fish that zebrafish can normally do. It's going to take a while, but that if one could use some of the genetic screening that if anything comes out of this, that would be useful. But you could use the genetic screens that already exist for dyslexia.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds to me as though you're busy enough anyway, without having to do that.
Yeah, it's true. We only look indirectly now to the genetic basis. So I think it would be, I think the number of our sample is maybe a problem because it's at the end it's a small number, but yeah, maybe by looking at candidate genes and having a focus on certain genes, we can still.
Yeah. No, I don't. There are practical difficulties.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks very much. That was terrific.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't see additional questions, and we are a little bit beyond time. So, maybe Anna, maybe we want to close the session.
Yes.
And I really like to thank Brian and Maaike for the beautiful presentation, and I'm sure they will be enjoyed by the people present here, by the people who listen to this presentation afterwards. So thank you again, and unless you have additional comments, we can close here the session.
No, thank you I enjoyed both of the presentations, so many thanks. And also thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks very much to you, Pierluigi, and to you, Anna, for setting it up. That was really, really interesting and good fun. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks also on behalf of MDPI. And just a final comment for the attendees. Remember again that we will post the recording in some days on the conference webpage, so you can go there to watch it. And you can also check on all the submissions for the conference. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.